My name is Vina, aka Miss WOC Reader, and welcome back to my channel. And I was watching a podcast recently where they were talking about the downfall of black media and how a lot of people are getting their news not from magazines or credited news resources anymore, but they're getting it from the Shade Room, the Breakfast Club, Baller Alert, Spiritual World, Hollywood Unlocked, and just all these other like Instagram pages or like other social media sites or radio shows. And they were talking about how hard it was for the people who are talking facts when it comes to political commentary to actually be heard compared to these different platforms, because there's a lot of agendas going on and you have certain sides pushing their narrative, and then people are just intaking that information without fact checking. They're only seeing like one strong talking point, but they're not seeing everything else. And I found it fascinating, especially because when you think of like the Breakfast Club, they spew ignorance basically every day on there. Like, they might hit like a good point once on the show, but a lot of times they are extremely biased and they are like standing behind some harmful people, and they are spreading harmful rhetoric, and they're just saying a lot of ignorant stuff. But at the same time, you see the vice president going down there to campaign, you see like the president going to campaign there, and they're getting invited to the White House. Like, you can't be basically a black TMZ and then have like political figures coming there to use that platform, because you don't see the same thing on TMZ, but that's how they're trying to reach black voters. And really, that's how a lot of people are getting their news, so they feel like they have to meet people where they are, which is listening to those platforms. And it had me thinking about how Charlemagne has an imprint with Simon & Schuster, and it's called Black Privilege. And it actually, from what I've seen, the books seem like they are being picked with thought. There is actually one called Shallow Waters that I'm very interested in reading on there. But it's so crazy that like you've made Charlemagne the face of this imprint to push these books about black excellence, knowing how much terrible like rhetoric he spews all the time on his platform. And I have a problem with book imprints in general, like as they've been doing them lately, just because we have these imprints that were created for diversity. They were handed to black people to be the face of, and then usually it's like a celebrity or just like a buzzy author, but they're not necessarily equipped to run this imprint. And we know most of the work anyway gets put on the editor of the imprint. Sometimes the editors of these imprints aren't even black, so I'm like, how are you putting somebody in charge to decide what black stories are worth publishing and they're not black themselves? Like, I had a friend who submitted to Disney, just Disney in general. The editor is a non-black editor. They do have a black editor there, but that's not who the submission went to. And this editor was like, "Oh, I would love to have your books like published through Freedom Fire, which is supposed to be the black imprint for black children." And again, this person is not black, but they're like, it fits a niche, underrepresented audience that really needs stories, and I don't know how to market it to them, so I'm going to have to pass. That's legit what they said. And it was so crazy to me. Like, first of all, you have this non-black person deciding like, oh, this would definitely fit a lot of black kids, but nope, can't have that. But also, you're just submitting in general, and they're like, oh, black story, let me just push it aside there to that imprint, whether it's a good fit or not. And like, I've seen that definitely in other spaces as well. Like, these imprints never really have their own editor solely focused on the imprint, able to do the work for that imprint. they're usually working for the publisher in general, working on various imprints and just pushing stories to the imprint instead of putting like the time and energy into carefully curating these books, which is terrible. And I'm seeing how these imprints, they're not doing like having the impact that they were supposed to have. So that's very interesting to me. But also, I see the types of people who are positioned in the publishing space to be the best sellers. And you have people like Nick Stone, who was comparing genocide to book bannings as if they're remotely on the same plane. And people just hit like on that post and kept running with it. Like, I'm like, did you listen to what the fuck she said? And then you had her posing in Israel in front of a bombed out hospital, like tagging it as bombed out hospital as if it was this chic aesthetic, like war torn was sexy. And a lot of people hit like on it and did not really realize until they started getting called out for it. And still now there's a lot of people who did not see that controversy and they just hit like on everything she says, regardless of if she's saying anything of substance or not. And I've read some of her books, and I read Jackpot, which I had so many issues with the representation of poor people in that book because she's clearly never been poor a day in her life. And a lot of what she was writing just did not ring true. And a lot of what she was writing was not confronted on text, like the mindset that was being pushed by the mother in there specifically. And just the danger the mother was putting her family in with her pride. Nobody ever addressed that. And I find that harmful as well because young people are the target for that book. And that book was getting a lot of praise for its poverty rep and not really challenged for what it was saying. And that's what I find happens a lot with these books. Like, we have these important books and they're considered so serious and they're so necessary, and then I read some of them and I'm like, there's a lot of questionable stuff in here that should be challenged, but I'm not really seeing reviewers challenge it. Other authors are not allowed to challenge it because we're in a day and age where like before, people's peers would challenge them on their work. Now, if you say anything against another author's work, it's a problem. Like, you are considered like bashing them, not being a proper colleague, etc., etc. And there definitely is room to have a nuanced conversation where it's not just like, this is bad completely, or like, this is just amazing. But I don't feel like we have enough of these nuanced discussions as much as we should. I also just heavily think about, especially for the children, what types of stories are being pushed at them. Like, I was having a conversation recently with an author friend, and we were discussing picture books and middle grade. And for picture books, I read a lot of them. I cover a lot of them, especially on Instagram and stuff. A lot of authors reach out to me and send me them, which I'm very grateful for. I read them to the kids, I review them, I talk about them. I've read some good ones, I've read some meh ones this year. And I noticed like a lot of the ones that get a major push from the publishers are like, for Black children, are like the ones about natural hair. We see so many of those come out a year and they're all like heavily pushed. So many about like, love your skin, Black child. And I'm not necessarily saying those things aren't important. I just think that there's an overemphasis on those things. Like, that should not be the whole story. We are in a day and age where you see a lot more Black people, like men and women, embrace their natural hair. When I was growing up, that wasn't so much as a thing. Like, I didn't get my first relaxer till 13, but I heard so many stories of a lot of people getting it much, much earlier. And like, I didn't see a lot of older women around me with their natural hair out. When I went to college, a lot of people went natural. I went natural myself, and that was really like during that second wave natural movement where a lot of people were like having pride about their hair and they were learning how to take care of their hair, and we were all sharing we're all sharing different products from Say Moisture, and we're all sharing different tips and tricks to grow out your hair and have your hair looking great. And so I think we've seen a major shift where now you can easily see more women wearing their natural hair and knowing how to take care of it, so children have that direct example from the adults in their life, so they have somebody to look up to who is wearing their hair and that's telling them that their hair is pretty. A lot of times when I hear people talk about their children having issues in school with their natural hair, they're usually going to all white schools, which is not the part that's ever really addressed in these books. Like, they're feeling bad about their natural hair because some white child who's not used to being around black people is seeing it for the first time and is making fun of it. Write a book about that. We don't need so many books just like your hair is pretty. We can just have the natural hair rep on page and have stories about children going on adventures, because there's so many black children who never get to leave their neighborhood. I've seen it around me. I knew people like that growing up. I hear friends who live across the country talk about it, especially teachers. Like, they have a lot of schools who, and like, the most kids get to see outside of their neighborhood is if they go on a school field trip, but they don't have a lot of funding to go on a ton of field trips. So a lot of kids need these stories where they can see themselves in different situations. I'm like, why is it a struggle bus to find a book with a black child going to the aquarium, with a black child going to the museum, with a black child visiting a major city? Like, it's so hard to find these adventure stories too. Like, we find all these stories for white kids, but like, there's a very specific niche. Like, last year we were lucky enough to get more books with like mermaids in them, so that black girls could see themselves as mermaids. But it took like a major motion picture coming out for more people to get interested in publishing and actually giving us those stories. Where are the black fairy books? Where are just the adventure picture books? I feel like we either get a lot of natural hair ones, or you get a lot of celebrating your community, which is important too, or celebrating music, which is also very important. But we're not seeing like a lot of the other ones. Like, I was talking to a friend who wrote one with black farmers. A lot of people have not seen any imagery in the media of black farmers, but it's such an important discussion right now, especially with just so much controversy over land grants and stuff being given to black farmers. Like, 2 weekends ago, I was in Philadelphia and I was with my mom and my cousin. We were going around for a Juneteenth celebration. I was taking an Uber, and the man who was our Uber driver was explaining to us, like, he was getting ready to head down to Georgia because his son and his son's wife got a land grant to open up a farm. So he's like, they have like, they're 40 acres, and they're going to classes. He was explaining to us to learn how to grow this produce, so eventually like the government will tell them what crop they're going to produce. And he was super excited about this opportunity for them, and it was just fascinating hearing him talk about the process, because it's something like I've been seeing in the news and I've been hearing people kind of talk about, and we see black farmers fighting for their land, but we don't see a lot of imagery of black children on the farm. Even though, like, during the fall, for example, at least where I am, you like to go to the farm and go like ride the hay rides and go pick a pumpkin and stuff like that. When I do see black kids on the farm in picture books, a lot of times it's not even written by black authors. That opportunity is given to white authors to write that story, and there's no cultural nuances within the pages because white people can't speak for our culture. So it really has me thinking of like how our kids kind of get boxed in by like, you can only have certain narratives pushed them, but they don't have the opportunity to explore and dream more. Because when you see this different imagery, it does cause you to think, oh, I can be that, oh, I can be that, because you're seeing somebody in that position and they're just not getting that. Same with, we've had a big conversation about racism in YA and middle grade, which now some publishers are listening, but they're not listening all the way, and they're correcting in the wrong way. Like, we have YA agents saying absolutely no trauma in books. I'm not accepting any of that. I'm like, but who gives you the right to dictate what black trauma is? Or you have authors going hard like, my book has no trauma, my book has no trauma, it's trauma free. And then you read the book and it's not trauma free. It's just that there is no centering of the white gaze. Well, actually in some of them there are, so that's a whole different issue. But there's like no centering of like police brutality. That doesn't mean it's trauma free at all. So like, wording is important. And I was looking up books, like as I always do, in Edelweiss recently, and I saw in the key selling points, because I like to read the key selling points on there. I find them very fascinating what the publishers think is like a selling point for the book, because a lot of times it's something stupid like the author is friends with so and so. Nobody gives a shit when they're picking out a book who the author is friends with. They really don't. And then sometimes some of them are like a little questionable to me. This was a case where it was questionable to me because it was like, it's a historical fiction that satisfies a niche market for books about black girls in historical settings that do not have anything to do with racism or slavery. And I found that odd because this book is set in the 30s and it's in the South. So yeah, Jim Crow is in effect. Like, that does to an extent affect how their life is going to be. I'm not like, you don't have to focus the book on white people. And that's all we're asking, is to not center the white gaze within these stories. But we're not saying like it has to be completely devoid of racism because, or any mention of race, because that's just not realistic at all, especially when we're talking about contemporary fiction. And when we were talking about like less racism in books, we weren't even focused on historical fiction, because let's be honest, there's not a ton of books, like of historical books in general, I feel like, that are pushed towards that market anyway. Like, how many books have you ever read about slavery from a children's perspective? I can't think of any on the top of my head. And what I noticed is a lot of people call something like a slavery book, and it's set after slavery was abolished. We can talk about people who didn't know they were free so well after slavery was abolished, but that's not the case here. Like, these are free people who are living after slavery has been abolished. Yes, Jim Crow is still in effect. That does not equal slave days, even though we can talk about the unequal rights that black people had back in the day. It's important to make the distinction of what time period we're in. Then, like, setting a book in the 1930s, that's not slave days. And again, like in the South especially, well, anywhere, because a lot of people have this idea of the North was so great, the North was so magical, everybody loved us, and that's not true either. I find it a very sticky situation when people kind of romanticize that era, and I do like these romances with Union soldiers, because I'm like, the Union also fucking hated black people. Like, they really did. And I see with Bridgerton now, there's a lot of black people pushing for like a romanticized version of our history, which is very dangerous, because we are at a time right now where white people are literally trying to erase history. These conservatives do not want us to talk about the history of this country at all. It was not all sunshine and roses whatsoever, especially for black people. And I saw this tweet, and a lot of people were liking it and not challenging it, where this woman's like, I need for somebody to do what Bridgerton did for Victorian England and do a romanticized version of New Orleans high society. They're like, I want the fancy balls, I want the Haitian cousins coming through. And I'm just like listening, and like I had two different people send me this thread. One person was saying it like, what the fuck is this woman on? The other person was saying it like, oh my gosh, I would love this, but I don't know how well they're going to execute it. I'm like, I wouldn't want them to execute this, because you cannot erase the nasty history of our country and just romanticize it and only take the pretty things and like the colonizers' costumes. Because every time people talk about running a pretty dress drama, I noticed they want like the colonizers' costumes. Like, they want to romanticize these situations of like these biracial or even like the quadroon balls. They want to romanticize that and act like that situation was so beautiful and create these love stories. And I'm like, I don't want to read about this mixed woman who is being told she's not human because she has a drop of black blood in her, but we're supposed to be happy that she's going off with this man whose family money came from slavery. Because that's what gets skirted around a lot too. His family money came from slavery. And we even had authors like Laquette and Adriana Herrera. I see people recommend her books all the fucking time, and she said it is okay for the hero of your historical romance to have owned a plantation. Like, well, if he owned a plantation, he had slaves running it. So you're saying that this woman is special, especially because you have like these biracial heroines. You're saying like this woman is special because she's this. Meanwhile, there's black people struggling on his plantation to make him the money, and they're living like this cushy life. And that is very gross to me. And you can't just whitewash the problems with our society, especially because a lot of people are not picking up a history book. A lot of people are turning to fiction to get their history, which is very concerning. I'm like, stop turning to fiction to learn, because at the end of the day, fiction is to entertain, and not all of it is fact checked. Some people are just taking the idea of something and then they're spinning their own tale. People were doing that in 2020, especially turning to fiction instead of nonfiction to learn about the strife of black people, because reading nonfiction accounts is too hard for them. And they're still doing that now. And I'm reading people like writing about stuff like situations with people growing up in the hood, and it's clear that they never grew up in the hood a day in their life. I see like, as a Caribbean American, I see other Caribbean Americans or like Caribbean British people who did not grow up like in mainland, writing these stories that are being pushed as if they are representatives for Caribbean culture. And I'm like, it's not the same as if you're getting it from somebody who is born and raised there, and they're kind of getting pushed over the people who are born and raised there. And I'm like, there's a lot of like different things that we would not know about the experience, especially if you're somebody who does not go back every year. Like, for me personally, I would never write that type of stuff just because I did not go back every year. We could not afford to go back every year. It was just easier for people to come and visit us. So like, my grandmother used to come and visit us. We've had like distant relatives come and visit us, like family friends come and visit us, but we just could not afford to go back for years and years and years. And it's only like in more recent years, like now that we have like more money, we've been able to go back a little bit more and visit our family down there. But a lot of our communication has generally been via the phone and people coming to visit us, and then like occasionally going to like New York, New Jersey, where there are higher concentrations of people from our background, but it's not the same. And I feel like a lot of people are kind of missing that. But like, you can't take that as a representation for an entire group, and that was the problem with Own Voices. Like, you had people who were like, oh well, they're black, so they can speak for the black experience. What they wrote is definitely factual, and that was not necessarily the case. So when I think about black media being in crisis and what everybody's talking about, I don't feel like books are factored into that, but they need to be. Everybody to an extent has their own agenda they're trying to push, and publishing definitely has their agenda they're trying to push. They definitely have a specific face of black people that they want to push. They have certain stories that are being pushed. I see a lot of the time like the more hood black people are kind of pushed out of publishing, like their narrative doesn't matter, especially now compared to like say the 2000s when I could see those stories were a lot more common on page, and just like a bit of an authentic experience is kind of pushed out because they're seeking specific voices of people who probably don't even live in a black community anymore. So that's something to think about. And you can't take everything you read in fiction at face value. And that's something we need to talk about more. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section down below. If you like this video, make sure and hit that like button. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!